What is up, guys? Welcome back to Core HTML Mastery. We're going to be getting started with the basics of writing HTML. The easiest way to start is to think of HTML as a series of elements, and these elements are going to be wrapped inside tags. And you can see those pointy brackets either side of the word tags. That's an example of how a tag is written in HTML. And anytime we open a tag, we also need to close the tag. So you can see an example of a tag being opened. We can then see an example of a tag being closed. It's the same as the opening tag, it just has a /. Now, to give an example of how this might look on an actual HTML page, we have this P element, and the P element designates a paragraph of text. So notice we have the opening tag, which is a P inside those angular brackets. We then have the content of the element, which in the case of a paragraph is going to be some text. We then close the tag with our /P. So that's an example of a paragraph element. It has some content, and the content is enclosed by the element tags, the paragraph tags in this case. Elements can also have attributes. So here's an example of that same element, but it now has an attribute. So notice we have our P tag being opened, but before the second angular bracket for that opening P tag, we have an attribute. And that attribute is class, and it has a value, which is editor note in this case. Attributes are going to be an important part of writing HTML. It depends on the element. To give you a simple example, we have an A element, and that stands for anchor tag. And when translated, that basically means it's a link. And as we know, when we click on a link, it takes us to another web page. Now, one of the attributes or properties that we have to give to that anchor tag is the location. So for example, a user clicks on our link. Where do we want that user to go? And we specify that making use of what's known as a href attribute. So we have href, we have equals, and then in either double or single quotes, we have the location of where we want that link or that anchor tag to take our user. Okay, so let's get started with a practical example, and we're going to write our first lines of HTML. So this is the checklist. We're going to create a folder, and we are assuming some basic computer literacy here, so hopefully you know how to create a folder. It can be anywhere really. It can be on your desktop, or it can be in a place where you want to keep all of your HTML code. And inside that folder, we're going to create a file with the name index.html. And the reason we do this, there's a convention in place here where when a request comes into a web server, we can of course configure the HTML document that's going to be returned to the user's browser. But assuming that we don't specify a HTML document to be returned, then usually the way a web server will work is it will look for the file with the name index.html. So it makes sense to call the main page in our website index.html. So we'll create a file with that name, and then we're going to open the folder containing that index file in our code editor. And at that point, we're going to be ready to go with our first line of code. Of course, we'll want to see the results of that code, and we can do that by opening our HTML file in our web browser. So we may not have realized this. Normally we associate web browsers with visiting web pages over the internet, but we can actually open a HTML file that's stored locally on our system inside our web browser. And that's what we're going to be doing in this video. So on the screen right now, you can see my core HTML folder. And if I have a look inside, we're actually mostly interested in this HTML folder inside that folder, which then has the index.html document. So what we'll do here is we are going to add this HTML folder to the code editor. And if we right click, we can see in our context menu, we have the option to open with code. Now this is just one way of doing it. You could also fire up your editor and then manually browse to the specific folder you want to work out of. But you can see we'll make use of this shortcut option right now, open with code. Our code editor fires up, and we can see the content of that directory. At the moment, it just contains index.html, and it's more or less a blank file, where we can see there is some very basic code there in place at the moment. Now, your document will be blank, And the recommended option is to start by adding some of this code into your HTML document. And we're going to start with this directive, doctype HTML. This should really be at the beginning of every HTML document. It's not technically HTML. This is actually a directive to the browser explaining what type of code is contained in this file. Generally, I find that if you didn't include this, your HTML would still work, but this is recommended best practice to include doctype HTML. We then need a HTML tag. So we actually write our HTML within HTML tags. So our entire HTML document will be inside the HTML tag. So notice we have open HTML tag and then close HTML tag with the /. Now there are some other important things that we should include by default, but we're actually going to cover those a little bit later in the course. So just to give you some simple examples, we actually want a head tag that's going to include information at the top of the document. We then likely want a body tag, and this is where most of our HTML is going to go. And inside of that head tag, you can see in our sample code here, we actually have these meta tags, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the course. Right now, we're not going to include any meta information, which is actually bad practice, but we want to approach this making use of the most simple elements of HTML first. So keep in mind, you will need a head ideally, and you will need a body. And we're going to start by writing our first HTML element inside this body. We're going to make use of the paragraph tag that we've already seen earlier in this session. And we're simply going to type hello world. This is really a rite of passage. Anytime we are learning a new language, we start with a script that prints hello world to the screen. So that's what we're going to do right now. So we'll save our document. And the next step is going to be to fire up this index.html inside a web browser. So if we navigate to our HTML directory, index.html, let's right click, we can choose open with, and then we can select our web browser. So let's choose Firefox in this case, which is my preferred browser for web development. And you can see hello world has been printed to the screen. So congratulations, you have now composed your first HTML document. You've loaded it up in a web browser. If we were to place this on a web server somewhere, it would render as a web page. Of course, it's not very interesting at this stage. We want to do a bit more of the HTML, so we'll continue looking at this in the next part of the course. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.